Yeah.
Send to him Caesar?
Well, remember,
Certainly.
before you go on, Pat, remember what we talked about in Revelation. The name Caesar applied to any Roman emperor at that time. That wasn't necessarily their name, but
Getting
this
them all.
began from the very beginning, and so that's what Jesus is saying. Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But go ahead and read it now.
Well, I never looked at it that way, so that's good. And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said, my eyes wouldn't jump up and, okay, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.
Okay. And also we can look what the Apostle Paul said in Romans the 13th chapter, verse 1. Karen?
Let every soul be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Okay,
and finally what Paul said to Titus in Titus the 3rd chapter, verse 1. Donna?
Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work.
Okay, so we see what the Apostle Peter said, we see what Paul said, and we see what Jesus said. But Christians seem to forget this charge. We are not called to be zealots who riot or picket against the government. And sometimes that may seem like it's difficult to do, especially when we have a government like we have today. But we see people unwilling to state their allegiance to this country. And just a personal point, I don't watch professional sports anymore just because of that. We pay them millions of dollars to play and everything, and then they disrespect our country. So I don't watch it. But we are subject to the laws of this nation, and we live in this nation, therefore we should have respect for this nation. The point that Peter is making is that Christians are to keep them to themselves and obey the laws. People break the laws all the time and think nothing of it. You drive down any one of these streets right now, and people drive 50 miles an hour while the speed limit is 40. Hefner Parkway, they'll drive 70 and 80 miles an hour on that. And I think police have just given up. They don't try to police this anymore. But we as Christians are to conduct ourselves honorably, and that's what Peter is trying to point out here. We must be careful in our blending of politics with Christianity. Chuck?
One thing I found out in studying this particular section of Scripture is that it doesn't matter whether it is right or whether it's wrong. If it doesn't violate God's law, we are to do it.
Well, and that's exactly right. That's what Peter is saying. That's what Jesus said, and that's what Paul has said here. We are to do it as long as it does not violate God's law. The idea is that we must be careful in our blending of politics and Christianity. God's will is that we do good, and silencing the criticism by our good works, not discrediting God by our works. Let's look at Romans the 3rd chapter and read verses 3 and 4, Florence.
For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, and avenger for execute wrath on him who practices evil.
So, we could ask the question, why should we submit to every human authority? And the answer is that this is God's will. This is exactly what Chuck was saying here. If we do not like the direction of our country, the answer is not to become more politically active and raise our voices in shouting about the government and its laws. We are to, in fact, show subjection to our government as long as it does not violate God's law. So consider our example. Consider Jesus as our example. When he came to this world to establish his kingdom, he submitted to the laws. Jesus established his kingdom by preaching the gospel to every person upon the face of the earth. The gospel was spread from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And you can go to Colossians, the 1st chapter, I believe it is, verse 23. The Apostle Paul said the gospel was preached to every living creature upon the face of the earth. That must be our focus. We must change the hearts one person at a time with the gospel, not through political zealotry. Look at what Paul said to Titus in Titus 2, verse 8. Isaac?
Sound speech that cannot be condemned, that he that is of contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you.
So if you look again at verse 16 of 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter tells us to live as people who are free. In other words, we are to be using our freedom to live as God's servants. We are not to use our freedom as a cover to commit evil. Just because our government is lax on laws does not give us the authority to break God's laws. For example, just because divorce and remarriage is okay by our government does not make it acceptable to God. There are many scriptures we can look at where God condemns that. And God gives a godly reason if divorce does take place. Just because our government says abortion is okay does not mean we had the freedom to do so. And even with the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade and everything, now you see that the pharmacies and state governments are trying to find a way around that by making abortion pills easily accessible to young people. And our woke culture and everything is trying to teach young people it's okay to have sex out of marriage and all this stuff. And when you play, you pay. Just because our government pushes same-sex marriage does not mean that it is acceptable in God's eyes. And yet, every television show you see today pushes same-sex marriage. I think the last 3 shows that Florence and I have watched on Wheel of Fortune, they have some homosexual in there. And they proudly boast the fact that, well, my partner or my husband. And it's just disgusting. But we are to obey God's laws. Do not use our freedom to commit evil. Live as exiles, knowing that the kingdom of God is what comes first. And if you go back to 1 Peter chapter 1, that's exactly who Peter is talking to, is those strangers abroad, those who were exiles. Let's look at Galatians, the 5th chapter, and Chuck, read verse 1 and then verse 13.
Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another.
Okay. So now let's look at verse 17 again and break it down a little bit, because Peter gives 4 quick admonitions here in verse 17. Let me just click onto that. Quick hits I'll put up here. He says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So let's look at exactly what Peter is telling us there when he says, honor everyone, or all people, whichever version you have. The idea is that it does not matter how someone treats us. We are to put the interest of others first. We are to show them honor and respect. Even if they do not respect us, we should still honor and respect them. So be aware that this is talking about the world. Honor people in the world. Okay? So the idea is that we are going to have to deal with people in the world. It's easy to honor our brothers and sisters in Christ, but Peter is talking about the fact that we should have this kind of respect and honor for people of the world as well. And then he goes on to say, love the brotherhood. Among the family of believers, there should be an even greater respect and honor. If we do not show God to be first and show our reverence and fear of God, then we will discredit God. So how will we influence the world if we treat God with the same importance as our hobbies, our recreation, or our work? No one will come to God if God is seen as just another activity in our life. And if you think about that, we do have a lot of Christians that do that. Christians that only come whenever it's convenient. And then they spend the rest of the time with their hobbies or various things. we can't come to God if we're going to treat him like another activity. And I think sometimes Christians live with penknife religion. They either cut that particular scripture out they don't like, or they take a ballpoint pen and black it out where they can't see it. But that doesn't make it less important. Chuck?
When you think that during this period of time, Nero was in power, and the suffering and the torment that those brethren had to go through, and yet Paul told them, "You do what's right, whether he's wrong or right."
Yeah. And Peter's doing the same thing here. And
That's hard. That's hard to. You have to have a heart ready for Christ to receive, or for you to receive Christ, to accept some of that stuff.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, Jack.
Wasn't it the first part of humanity, weren't the kings that appointed and put in there by God, weren't they a little more understanding, a little more humane? Then he got bad after a period of time goes.
Well, that's true. Even Nero, when he first took over as emperor, Nero was a pretty good guy. I mean, if I remember right, he took over at the age of 16, but it didn't take him very long to be one of the most corrupt emperors that Rome had. And sometimes that's what happens with power. You look at some of our politicians today, when they first went into politics, they were pretty good people. But it didn't take them long to be pretty corrupt either.
Some of them were always liars, and some of them turned into liars.
That's true. That's very true. So, good point. All right, so the third thing that he points out, he says, honor the king. The idea is that being exiles in this world means that we must always show our allegiance to God. If we do not show God to be first and show our reverence and fear of God, then we will discredit God. So the question is, how will we influence the world if we treat God with the same importance, okay? This does not mean that we necessarily agree with their lives, their decisions, or their actions, but it does mean that we are not slanderers, but are respectful of all people, and we will not speak ill of our leaders, okay? So, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. If a Roman emperor was to be honored and respected, then every government official deserves the same honor. And that's exactly what Jesus said. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God. So we are aliens and strangers in this world. We need to show a different life from the way others act and the way others live. We need to live honorable lives, reflecting the laws and the attitudes of Jesus, and our good deeds should sway people to favor the Lord. Any comments on verse 17? Verses 18 through 25 is talking about serving like Jesus. Serving like Jesus. What we're going to look at then is the principles governing the Christian's behavior in suffering. Our response to abusive authority. Remember in verse 16, Peter told us to live as servants of God. And Peter's in the midst of discussing the attitude, service, and submission as a reflection of being God's people. Let's look at verses 18 through 20. Lola? I'm sorry, Nola.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Lola. I call my GPS Lola.
Okay.
She's looking around for Lola.
I'm getting old, you know. I have a lot of gray cells up here. Nola, please, 18
Okay.
through 20.
Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if, for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it patiently, endure it, this finds favor with God. That's a hard one for me.
Yeah,
Amen.
For
It is.
anyone.
do what?
Would be for anyone. I have felt that feeling, and it's tough.
Oh, it is tough. And that's why we need to focus on that word submissive or submit, okay? If you notice what I have up there, it means to subject oneself, to obey, be subject to, according to Vines. To submit orders or directives of someone. To obey, to submit to, obedience, submission is what it means. In other words, we need to yield to those who are over us. Okay? The HCSB version does a good job in translation by rendering this as household slaves. It is the Greek word most commonly used for house servants in that day, when you see that word submit, okay? Their Christian duty was to yield to their masters. And so the other part of it is servants. The word servants, the Greek word for servants, means household or domestic servants, as I mentioned there. Luke chapter 16, verse 13. Stephanie?
No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
Okay. And Romans 14, verse 4.
Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand.
Okay. So the idea that's being put forth here, particularly what Jesus is saying in Luke, the 16th chapter, is if we don't put God first, then we're serving some other master. And this is what Jesus is saying. We can't do that. We either give our genuine love to Christ or we give our genuine love to the world. This is not the common term that we saw back in verse 16. If you remember in verse 16, it said, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak of vice, but as bondservants of God. Okay? That bondservants there is not the same term that we see here as servants. Basically, contracted employees is another way of looking at it. Let me put that up here. The epistles frequently mention of servants suggest that many first century Christians belong to this class, and we'll look at some of those scriptures. We'll not look at all of them, but it suggests that, well, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, Jack. And then we'll look at Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 8, and that's the only ones we'll look at in this. Because this is the Apostle Paul talking to the Corinthian brothers, talking to the church at Ephesus, and also talking to Timothy. So, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 21 through 23, Jack.
Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men, brethren, that each that covers the slaves of men.
Okay. Now again, depending on which version you're looking at, that word slaves in other versions is the word servants. So that's the idea that we're looking at here. So let's look what the Apostle Paul said to the church at Ephesus in Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 8. Pat?
Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. with goodwill, doing service as the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord.
Okay. So basically what it means is contracted employees. Because this phrase seems to be most appropriately addressed to household servants. I think it is a fair parallel for us to apply Peter's words to employment here. Jack?
Well, all Christians are slaves of Christ. I mean, it's voluntary, but they're slaves of Christ.
Yes. Slaves, we're servants, we're contracted employees of Christ.
It's just like the debt slaves, the Israelites. Some would become slaves, sell themselves for a term of work, labor.
Yeah.
They're just debt slaves.
Yeah.
They're not really slaves, but it's a voluntary deal.
Yeah. Well, it's not really a voluntary deal because God created us and God expects us to follow His commandments.
Well, I mean,
And
let's
so-
say voluntary, they agreed.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why I said I want to look at it as if we are contracted employees. If we, for example, our jobs here, I mean, I don't work anymore except everything my wife tells me I do a lot of work. But if we are working for a salary and our boss says, I want you here at such and such time, and I want you to work, and I'll give you a lunch break, and then I want you to go back to work, and you'll work till such and such time, and then you can go home for the day. And you do this every day, 5 days a week or 6 days a week, and there are some employers that want you to work 7 days a week. The point is, if you miss any part of that, what happens?
You don't get paid.
You don't get paid, and you may get fired. But we treat God just the opposite. God says, I expect you to do this, 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 this. And we say, no, we just want to do this. And what's going to happen?
He's going to fire them.
He's going to fire us. And we're not going to like it.
That F-I-R-E, I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The real F-I-R-E.
Yeah. We're not going to like it.
You ain't gonna receive the pension for sure.
That's true.
You're
And so,
fired to us.
the word masters, this is another definition that I want you to focus on. One who possesses supreme authority is what Vines is saying here. One who owns and or controls the activities of slaves or servants or subjects with the implication of absolute and in some instances arbitrary jurisdiction. And this would be the same thing as an employer here upon this face of the earth. They have complete authority over us if we want to work for them. You know, Martin Luther King says, find a job you love and you never have to work a day in your life. And he also said, if you're going to be a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper you can be. And I like that terminology because if you're going to be a Christian, be the best Christian you can be. Don't do it haphazardly because God's not going to accept us if we do not obey His commandments completely. So basically, the boss who owns the contract of which one is bound is what this means when we see the word masters. There are differences, though. We can quit if we do not like our employment, can't we? But a household servant cannot quit. And we are household servants of God. We cannot quit. If we quit, then we are going to suffer the punishment. We have rights that protect us from many kinds of mistreatment. But the employee of a boss does not. If this was meant for the household servant, then since our situation is not as drastic or grave, we should be able to use the same principles for our employment circumstances. With this in mind, let us consider Peter's instructions then. So he says, Christians are to be submissive to those over them, and it is not conditioned on our knowledge. It is not conditioned on our ability. Yes, no.
Well, I'm just going to say, we're like slaves in one sense. When we come to the Lord, we didn't know we were going to do that until we studied, and we may have a job, and we can't get out of that job because we're in debt. But we work to get out of debt so that that's not over us anymore. And I've seen people in the church, when I first became a Christian, they got on a young man. He wasn't educated, and he worked at a gas station, and his hours didn't allow him to be at both services. And the brethren stood so straight, they made him quit his job. He couldn't make his bills. This is wrong, because we're in the same position, I think, as the servants of those times.
Yeah.
So you work to get out of wherever you are so that you don't owe anybody but to love them.
Yeah. And that's exactly your point is a good point. I mean, I wasn't there, but if I was trying to encourage someone to quit a job, I'd certainly try to help them find another job before I just tell them you got to starve to death, because we got to take care of our brethren. But the idea of submission here that Peter's talking about is it's not conditioned on the amount of knowledge we know about the Scriptures. Okay? We can play ignorant all we want. We can refuse to study the Scriptures and say, okay, what I know is enough, sufficient. But God condemns us for not studying. You have to remember in the book of Acts, what did the Bereans do?
Daily.
They studied daily. I say this because I'm guilty of it, I guess. But you see a lot of our young people out there that during the sermon and even during Bible class, they're sitting there with a notepad taking notes. Now, I think back in school, and if I wanted to have a good grade, I took notes on the subject that the teacher was teaching, because I had to study those notes and prepare for the class and the test that was coming. And yet, when it comes to studying the Bible, sometimes we don't do what we should do. And that's why I admire the young people that are taking there with notes and sitting there writing what the preacher says, because it forces them to pay attention. I've watched Diana Dow. She knows sign language for the deaf. And I've watched her even during songs. She'll sit there and she'll do the signs of the songs. And I talked to her one time. I said, Dan, why are you doing that? And she says, it forces me to think about the words. And I thought, that's important, because if we're going to make it to heaven, we do need to spend time studying and understanding exactly what God expects of us. Submission does not mean that it is conditioned on our ability. Some people have the ability to preach. Some people have the ability to lead singing. Some people have the ability to lead prayers. Some people don't have any ability at all, because they don't try to have any abilities. Okay? But being submissive is not conditioned on our ability or our experience, nor is it based on the goodness or badness of the one with authority. Okay? The idea is that we are to submit with all fear, regardless of the economic system we are in. And we must always remember the master we are serving in Christ. Look at Ephesians, the 6th chapter, verses 5 through 6. Karen?
Bond servants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart.
All right. Look at the last part of verse 18 then. Depending on which version you're looking at, it could say even the unjust, but in the New King James Version it says, but also to the harsh. We are to show respect and yield to those who are good and gentle, but also we are to do the same thing for those who are unjust. The NET version gives a good rendering about this. It says, but also to those who are perverse. The word translated unjust by the ESV and perverse or by the NET means those who are curved or those who are crooked. Okay?
What about froward?
What about what?
Froward, it says, but also to the FROWARD.
Oh, forward?
Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing. Yeah. So the idea is that your masters are not doing what is right and good, but as Christians, we will show them respect and yield to them anyway. Now, how can we do this? How is it possible? Well, Peter sets forth a principle, if you will, here that may be applied to any situation where unjust suffering occurs. Look again at verse 19. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering, and wrongfully. So, what verse 19 is telling us to do is, by being mindful of Christ, we must submit for the sake of God. We will endure sorrows while suffering unjustly, but Peter says that this is a gracious thing. This is grace and commendable. This is to our credit, if you will, when we endure in this way. We endure mistreatment for the sake of the Lord. So, how is this for the Lord's sake? Go back to verse 15, if you will, and look at verse 15, where Peter says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And look what Paul said to the church of Colossians, in Colossians the 3rd chapter, verses 22 through 25. Donna?
Slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord after rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality.
Okay. So, the idea, and we'll not take time to read these verses here because Donna just read Colossians 3, verse 25. God will reward our faithfulness and our endurance, and will also punish the wicked. So, we as Christians should keep doing good, showing ourselves to be different from the world, so that we can silence foolish people and bring them to glorify God. Today, most people will bring lawsuits, complain, act evil in return, steal, or do something to the master who mistreats them. But see, Peter says that we as Christians are not to act like that. So look again at verse 20, if you will. Verse 20 again says, for what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently, but when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. So the idea that Peter is bringing out is that we should be suffering for doing good. If we suffer for sin, there is no credit for that. If we are mistreated by our masters because we are acting out of line and are not yielding to their authority, then we are getting what we deserve. That's what Peter is saying here. So often this is the exact problem. It's exactly our problem that we are doing wrong and authority smacks us for our wrong and we think we are being mistreated. But we are deluding ourselves. We see this a lot in society today. A young man is arrested and the parents come out and say that he is a good boy. He's such a good kid. However, his actions spoke otherwise. Wandering around with weapons and with troublemakers and evildoers and being wicked is not being a good kid. We will be arrested and we will justly suffer if we do those things. Any comments? All right, so I know our bell's about to ring, but we'll finish this verse 20 up here. The idea is that grace is when we are doing good, and we are respectful if we still are mistreated. Notice it there in verse 20. If we do good and suffer and endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. This is the second time that Peter said that this is grace and favor with God. Yes, Jack?
It seems easy to take that out of context. The context of that is being good Christian-wise and be beaten for it.
Yes.
It's a different story than just being out here doing nothing and somebody comes up behind you and hits you in the back of the head and beats up on you. That's a different context there in this.
So you're saying we should retaliate?
Let's turn the cheek, right? And
Well,
like the other one.
if it's some punk, I'm not turning the other cheek.
Coming up with a fist.
If it's a Christian person just having a misunderstanding or a bad day and he takes out, I might can turn the other cheek, but I'm not turning it for some idiot.
I think God expects us to protect ourselves,
I
but at
agree.
the same time, I think God expects us not to retaliate just because someone speaks evil of us
Right.
or
Right.
mistreats us in those ways. Okay?
Well, the sticks and stones may hurt, but the words never hurt you.
Front
That's
church
okay.
worse, huh?
That's what the word endures grief means.
Yeah. Yeah.
Accepting it without retaliation.
Yeah. That's true. So, all right. I know the bell's about to ring, so we'll stop here and we'll finish up chapter 2 next week and answer the questions. So we want to begin by looking at verses 21 through 24 next week. And that's... Oh. Yeah, we'll look at those verses there real quick next week. 1 Peter chapter 3, and see what Peter says to in chapter 3 there. So, not doing good. I
So
think
we're
it's
going to finish
important.
21 through 24 and then the questions and then go into 3.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yes, but before we read verses 21 through 24, we'll look at verses 14 through 17 of chapter 3 of 1 Peter for just a minute.
Okie dokie.
One and then go back.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, actually, we're not going back because I had in my notes to look at that, to look at what Peter's saying about doing good.
See the video of
Thank
the
you.
lady's son who got shot.
That's all right, now people have probably been
Broke into a
backwards
house.
all my life.
And she
Yeah, I know.
literally come out and said,
I am definitely
I
Baptist.
shouldn't have to worry about my son getting shot every time he breaks into a house.
Oh, yeah?
Think about the words you're saying, lady. I was just like, are you that ignorant?